Alright, this video lecture is going to cover some of the things that we didn't get a chance to cover in class. So we're going to start off by talking about emerging adulthood. Now, Arnett argues that emerging adulthood is this new period of the lifespan that has developed that's between adolescence and adulthood. So it's this time when people feel like they're not adolescents anymore, but they're not quite adults yet. Okay, so when we ask people the question, do you feel like you're an adult? And we give them three options, yes, no, or in some ways yes, in some ways no. Emerging adults will often answer in some ways yes, and in some ways no. Now, there's really, this really happened because the markers of adulthood have shifted. So what I mean by markers of adulthood is how do we define adulthood, okay? Because in the past, if we think back a couple of generations, our grandparents used to think, oh, well, once I get a job and get married and have children, I will be an adult, all right? But if we think about our own ideas of what it means to be an adult, they may not be the same anymore, all right? Because if you think about it, you know people in your life who are not married, who don't have kids, who you absolutely consider to be an adult. And we can also maybe think of some people in our lives who have children and are married, but we don't consider them to be an adult quite yet. All right, so now it's not about these role transitions. Role transitions are things like getting married, buying a house, finishing college. They're a transition in our role. We go from non-homeowner to homeowner. We go from non-parent to parent. We go from single to married. Okay, these are role transitions. But when we think about how we define adulthood now, there are less concrete attributes. So let me give you some examples here. So when we ask people, what does it mean to be an adult? These big three things come up a lot. The first is, people say, in order to be considered an adult, you need to take responsibility for the consequences of your actions. All right, now this is harder to say whether or not you've accomplished this. Right? With the role transitions, it's really easy to say yes or no, right? Are you married? Yes or no, right? Do you have children? Yes or no. That's really easy to define. But if I say, do you take responsibility for the consequences of your actions? You might say, sometimes, right? It's harder to say yes or no to that. Another big thing that comes up when we ask people, what does it mean to be an adult? They say you need to be able to make independent decisions without the influence of other people. And again, this is hard to say yes, whether or not you fully do this or not. Lastly is financial independence. Now this one is tough because we don't reach financial independence all at once, right? Sometimes it takes people a little while and there are little steps in between. So maybe you have a job and so you start paying rent to your parents. You're not financially independent yet, but you're starting to be. All right, and then maybe you move out, but your parents still maybe help out by paying for your cell phone bill, or maybe they bring groceries over when they come and visit you. They're still helping you financially at that point. And so this transition into financial independence isn't necessarily an all-at-once sort of thing. So when we think about it, if our definitions of adulthood are a little bit ambiguous, right? They're a little bit hard to say. It makes sense that it's hard for us to say whether or not we're an adult or not, and that maybe we feel like we're on the way to being an adult, but we're not quite there yet. So Arnett talks about the 5 features of emerging adulthood. He says that first off, it's the age of feeling in between. All right, this is feeling like you're not adolescent anymore, but you're not fully an adult yet. Okay, so it's this in-between period. We also know that it's a time of instability, and we mean this in terms of your work, right? So often in emerging adulthood, people are trying different jobs or maybe trying different majors. There's instability in terms of your romantic life, right? You're dating different people, trying to figure out who works best for you, who do you want to end up with, what type of person do you want to end up with. We see that it's also unstable in terms of your residential status. So people may move out of their parents' house to an apartment. Maybe they move into a dorm if they're going to college. Maybe they move in with their friends or with a romantic partner. Then if it doesn't work out, they move back in with their parents. So there's a lot of moving around in emerging adulthood. We also see that it's a period of self-focus. This is the time in life when you don't really have any other responsibilities to other people, right? You're no longer in the house with your parents anymore, so you're not answering to them on a daily basis, and you don't have children yet, you don't have a spouse yet, so this is really a time when you have a chance to focus on you and what you want and what your goals in life are. It's also the age of possibilities, all right, meaning that you haven't really made any commitments yet, all right? You're not committed to a particular person or a job, and so you have a lot of possibilities open to you. And lastly, it's the age of identity explorations. Now remember in class we talked about Erikson, and Erikson said this happens during adolescence. But more and more research is pointing to the fact that we continue to explore our identities in emerging adulthood. And we see that Arnett argues that this period of emerging adulthood is not universal. This is not something we would see in all cultures. We see this particularly in cultures where there is more affluence, so they have more money and more time and sort of the luxury to take their time when transitioning to adulthood. In other countries where there's not as many financial resources, people may have to just hurry up and find work after they move out of adolescence, and so they're expected to become adults right away. All right, so moving from emerging adulthood, when we finally decide, okay, well, I feel like I'm an adult now, we reach early adulthood. So coming back to Erikson, Erikson argues that his sixth stage of his psychosocial development is intimacy versus isolation. So after we establish our identity, right, the last stage, stage 5, was identity versus role confusion, we see once we establish who we are, we can then develop intimacy with another person, right? So intimacy refers to close relationship with either a spouse or with friends or someone, okay? And if there aren't these sort of connections made, the other option here is isolation. And this takes place during early adulthood, is when we're really starting to establish this sense of intimacy with another person. And we see that there's a lot of diversity in how people make that connection, right? So we see that some people find a partner and they get married. Then they decide this may not be the person for me and they get divorced, they get remarried again. We also see that there's some people who find a partner and decide, you know what, we don't have to get married. Let's just live together and be together. We have more people also staying single for longer periods of time, not really developing that sense of intimacy with one particular person. So there's a lot of diversity here when we're looking at relationships here in adulthood. We also see that there has been this increase in cohabitation, right? Cohabitation is living with a romantic partner without being married. And so there is more of this going on in the United States, and we see that in other parts of the world it's very, very common. We see that people are also getting married at a later age than they have in the past. So for example, in 1980, the average age of marriage for males was 24.7 years old. And on average, women got married around the age of 22. But however, when we look at 2013, we see that men on average get married at the age of 29, and women on average get married at the age of 26.6. So here in the United States, we see that we're getting married at later and later ages. So your book talks about some ways that we can have a successful marriage. One is to develop a sense of admiration and fondness for your partner. Another one is to turn to your partner as a friend, all right? So being there as a source of comfort and support from one another. We also see stop trying to seek power in the relationship. This can be damaging to a relationship. And also when solving conflicts, make sure to do it together. All right, so moving on to middle adulthood, we see that Erikson says in this stage, we have something called generativity versus stagnation. And this takes place during middle adulthood. Generativity is this sense that you've given back to the next generation, sort of that you've passed on the torch, so to speak, to the next generation, that you're sort of leaving your legacy, right? And so we see that if you don't feel like you've done enough in your life to sort of leave something for the next generation, then you have this sense of stagnation. So How can we do this? Well, there are lots of different ways. Okay, we can do this through work. All right, we can do this maybe through volunteer contributions, feeling like we've sort of given back to society. But we can also do this by having children, right? And so when we have children, one of the questions that comes up in psychology is, are parents happier than non-parents? Well, we do see that there's some mixed results here. Okay, first of all, we see that parents are generally happier than non-parents, but we see that when parents have their first child, their happiness level drops at first, right? And we also see that even though parents are happier, they're also more stressed. We also see that when we compare single parents with single people who are not parents, the single parents are less happy. And that makes sense because being a single parent is very stressful. We also see that what helps with happiness is making sure that you have enough money. All right, parents who have enough financial resources do tend to be happier. All right, now let's talk a little bit about late adulthood and what happens there. All right, so according to Erickson, this is the last stage, and this is integrity versus despair. All right, so this is during late adulthood, as I said, and having this sense of integrity is feeling like you have lived your purpose here in life, right? That you can look back at your life without any regrets. That, of course, maybe you may have made a few mistakes along the way, but that those mistakes made you who you are, and that, you wouldn't be where you are without those mistakes. All right, and so looking back at your life and realizing that, yeah, I did have a good life. There are some people who look back at their life and they have a lot of regrets. Maybe they've lost touch with important people in their lives. Maybe they didn't accomplish what they wanted to, and that results in this feeling of despair. All right, so that's the end of that socio-emotional development section, and we are going to move on to moral development. So when talking about moral development, the big name that comes up is Lawrence Kohlberg. Now what Kohlberg did was he wanted to understand how people thought about what was right and what was wrong. And so what he did was he came up with 3 levels. All right, the first level is called the pre-conventional level. And the focus of the pre-conventional level is focusing on punishments and rewards to you. So for example, if I get punished for doing something, it must be morally wrong. And if I get rewarded for doing something, it must be morally right. So let's say I get in trouble for hitting my sister. Hitting my sister must be morally wrong. Has nothing to do with, oh, I hurt my sister or hurting other people's bad. No. It has more to do with, oh, well, I get punished for it, therefore it must be wrong. Okay, so in the pre-conventional level, the focus is very much on the self and the consequences to the self. But Kohlberg says we progress past that to what we call the conventional level. In the conventional level, the focus is on society and other people's expectations. So we focus a lot here on the law. Okay, so for example, if it's against the law, it must be morally wrong. So a good example of this is jaywalking. Okay, jaywalking is illegal. And someone in the conventional moral development level would say, oh, then jaywalking must be morally wrong. But Kohlberg says we also pass this to go to the post-conventional level, and this is really developing your own personal moral code. It's not about rewards and punishments. It's not about the law, because we know sometimes the law can be flawed, and sometimes the law is not about a moral issue. So for example, coming back to this example of jaywalking, I might say, okay, yes, jaywalking is against the law, but it's not morally wrong to do it. Okay, so that's looking at it from a post-conventional level. And Kohlberg argues that we progress through these 3 levels as we move through the lifespan, so that children are more at the pre-conventional level, children and teenagers are at the conventional, and once we move to post-conventional, it's like late adolescence and adulthood. All right, but there are some critics of Kohlberg here. Gilligan argues that this is very biased towards males, all right, and that females are not really considered in Kohlberg's model here. We also see that this is not applied to all cultures, that not everyone reaches post-conventional moral reasoning. And lastly, it's not just about moral reasoning, but also about behavior.